Execution isn't where organizations fail. It's where failure actually becomes visible. Think about this for a second. An executive team spends months on a strategic plan. The vision is clear, the goals are reasonable, the budget is set. Everyone leaves the room thinking that they're aligned. 6 months later, half of your initiatives, they quietly disappear. Departments are moving in separate directions. Meetings are becoming status updates more than they're becoming decision-making sessions. People are frustrated. Leadership starts asking the question, why can't we execute? But what if that's the wrong question? What if execution isn't even the problem at all? What if execution is simply revealing something much deeper? Because years after studying organizations, there's something that I've noticed. Organizations are remarkably predictable. And not because people are predictable, but because systems are. And once you start looking at an organization like it's a system, instead of just collections of people, all of this starts to make more sense. One of the most common conversations I hear from executive teams, it goes like this. We need more accountability. We need communication to improve. We need our leaders to go through leadership training. Our communication needs work. Those conversations aren't wrong, but they're just incomplete because accountability, communication, culture, execution, those are all outputs. They're not inputs. Those are all visible behaviors being produced by an organizational operating system. Imagine walking into a hospital to a busy ER where that ER is always backed up. The patients are waiting, the staff is frustrated. Everyone agrees that something needs to change. You could tell the nurses to move faster. You could tell the physicians to communicate more. You could hold leaders accountable. And you may see that change, maybe for a day, maybe for a week. But unless you understand where the bottleneck is, that line is always going to come right back. Organizations work the same way. Visible problems always stem from invisible causes. I've watched organizations in completely different industries struggle with the almost identical symptom, whether it be healthcare, public service, manufacturing, financial services, nonprofits. The industry may change, but the systems don't. Meetings that create agreement, but no action. Projects that lose momentum right after kickoff. Departments protecting their own priorities. Employees waiting for permission. Leaders spending more time reacting than leading. Communication increase while clarity decreases. Most executives assume that those are separate problems, but they're usually not. They're all connected. The different symptom is being produced by the same operating system. That's why solving a symptom rarely helps the organization. I have sat in meetings where executive teams sit there and beat the crap out of the conversation concerning accountability. And it was not because their leaders were not talented. They were very talented. It was quite the opposite. It was because even though that they were experienced executives, they were committed, they were intelligent, they were successful. But every department measured accountability differently. Operations, they believed accountability meant ownership. Finance believed it was measurable by outputs. Human resources, they measured it by follow-through. Clinical leadership, they believed it was due to professional responsibility. Every person used the same word, but every person measured it differently. The discussion didn't fail because people disagreed. It failed because the operating system, it functioned exactly the way it was set up to. By the end of the meeting, everybody thought they had solved the problem, but nothing changed. Not because they weren't capable, it simply was behaving consistently with its design. And this is where most organizations, they start chasing those symptoms. Execution slows down, so the leaders put on more meetings. Communication becomes confusing, so they start sending more emails. People hesitate to make decisions, so this is when a layer is added to make those decisions. The organization becomes reactive, so the leadership works harder. Have you noticed something? Every solution was focused on the visible behavior. Very few organizations ask, what about our operating system is producing this behavior? That's the better question, because systems create behavior. It's not the other way around. Organizations behave exactly like an operating system. Think about a phone. There's an app that you've downloaded and it keeps crashing. You don't blame the screen. You don't even change the battery. You start investigating that app and that operating system. Organizations, they deserve the same type of thinking. Vision, it enters the system. Priorities, that moves through the system. Information, that moves through the system. Decisions, they move through the system. Resources, those also move through the system. Everything moves through that system. And if friction exists anywhere, the execution is going to change. Not because people are getting in the way, but because the system is altering the outcome. Execution is simply that final output. Organizational friction is not loud. It is very subtle. It's the meeting where everybody leaves and they understand something differently. It's the project that changes ownership 3 times quietly. It is where 2 departments measure success differently. It is where middle management is translating executive strategy because they weren't sure what it actually meant. It is where an employee stops making decisions because every decision they made, it was overturned. None of these events are catastrophic individually, but collectively, it can completely change your organization. And over time, friction becomes normal. People actually stop noticing it. And then one day leadership says, we suddenly developed execution problems. No, the execution problems simply became impossible to ignore. Every organization is unique. Here's another mistake a lot of organizations make. They borrow solutions. They read the book that worked someplace else. They borrowed a framework that worked someplace else. The consultant implemented something someplace else. But the organization, it's not a franchise. It's a living system. 2 organizations can look identical at the surface, but be driven completely different with causes underneath. One organization's communications problem may be decision-making issue. Another's communication problem could be prioritization. Another's communication problem could actually be an incentive problem. Same symptom, different organizational process, different diagnosis, different solution. That's exactly why meaningful organizational improvement becomes from understanding the organization that's in front of you, not implementing somebody else's blueprint. Let's talk about better questions that actually can help change your organization. Instead of asking, why aren't people executing? Ask, what are the conditions that make execution difficult? Instead of asking, why don't people communicate? Ask, what is our system rewarding? Instead of asking, why don't people take ownership? Ask, what is it that's making ownership unclear? Those questions don't produce fast answers. They produce better ones. And better questions almost always lead to better organizational decisions. This is why at BA Solutions, we believe organizations improve differently. Not because they're filled with different people, but because they're built on a different operating system. Every organization is its own operating system and its own organism. It has its own history, it has its own patterns, and it has its own friction, which means meaningful improvement doesn't start the same way every time. Diagnose before prescribing, understanding before changing, investigating before acting. Because if you just chase a symptom, you may have temporary performance improvement. But if you understand the system, you could change the organization's future. The next time somebody tells you that your organization has an execution problem, pause before agreeing, because execution may not be telling you what's actually wrong. It may simply be revealing that there's been something happening under the surface the whole time. Because organizations are remarkably honest. Their behavior always reflects their operating system. The question is whether or not you're willing to study that system, or if you're just going to continue to chase the symptoms. If the conversation today changed how you think about your organization, download our Leadership Mistakes Playbook. It is written to help leaders recognize the patterns that create organizational friction before they become failure. Because organizations improve when leaders understand their system, not just the symptoms. Every organization tells its own story. Unfortunately, most leaders, they just read the final chapter. The organizations that improve are the ones who are willing to go back and understand how the story was written in the first place.